Clive Bull on LBC.
LBC, I'm Clive Bull, and it's time now for the Legal Hour. And this week we are looking at property and housing and landlord and tenant issues, buying and selling, renting. If you've got a question for lawyer and expert Russell Conway, who's senior partner at Oliver Fisher Solicitors, that's in Notting Hill in London, then do call us now. And Russell, we're going to talk first of all about an issue that has cropped up a couple of times. There's been now an official investigation into the leasehold property market, and it seems like buyers are not always being treated fairly.
No, they're not. And why are we interested about that? Well, there's 4.3 million leasehold properties in England, 69% of those being flats, and rather surprisingly, 31% of them being houses. And people who have leasehold properties are getting quite angry about their situation. In fact, one of the organisations that promotes them, the National Leasehold Campaign, has described this as the PPI of the housing market, and that's an interesting take on the situation. And recently we've had two reports, one from the Law Commission, which really focused on how to get lease extensions and how to value those. But last week we had a really interesting report from the Competition and Markets Authority, which is an organisation which has teeth and can prosecute and can bring freeholders to court, which highlighted any number of issues which really do need to be legislated on. We really must see some change. For example, this situation regarding ground rents, which go up every few years. In some instances, the ground rents can double every few years, and eventually people are going to find themselves paying 50, 60, £100,000 in ground rent. That cannot be allowed to continue. There must be legislation on that. There's the cost of getting the freehold. People are promised the ability to enfranchise, to acquire the freehold, but the costs of that can be crippling, and the process is so complex. It has to be simplified. There's a great deal of misleading information given. Sometimes when you're buying a leasehold house, the estate agent or the developer or all of them will say, well, there's no difference between freehold and leasehold. It's all the same. It's your property. But it sure isn't the same, because when you're a leaseholder, you've got to pay a service charge. You've got to pay for your insurance. If you want to change the kitchen around or knock a wall down, the freeholder will take a whacking great fee from you. There are so many differences. And if you're buying a leasehold property, you need to know what it is you're being sold. There's so many fees that kick in when you're a leaseholder. For example, if you want to rent out your home, quite often there's a provision in the lease which says the freeholder gets a fee for allowing that. The problem I just highlighted, knocking down a chimney breast or moving the bathroom around, again, you may need a licence for alterations, and the freeholder may charge you £2,000 for that. This is something that people didn't know when they were buying their leasehold flat. So the government needs to think about legislating on these issues. 4.3 million properties, that's a lot of votes. But there are powerful interests lobbying against such legislation. And to be fair, there hasn't been much legislation on leasehold flats in the last 20 or 30 years. We need to see a change urgently.
And also we need to see a change, don't we, in the way the system works of kind of extending your lease. It seems incredibly complicated.
Well, the Law Commission report really focused on that, but in my opinion, it was a fairly mealy-mouthed report. The problem with lease extensions is that there's something called marriage value. After your lease goes below to 80 years, you have to pay marriage value to the freeholder. And I've seen calculations from valuers which run to 12 pages trying to work out what that marriage value is. Now, the Law Commission said you could either abolish marriage value completely, which is what I would advocate, or you could halve marriage value, or you can just keep the system as it is. Well, I think anyone who has a lease which has crept below the 80-year level would think it extremely useful if the government could legislate on this, because not only is there the problem with marriage value, but the whole system of getting a lease extension is relatively complex for the layman in the street. And although there's a tribunal that deals with it, it's still frightening to have to go to a tribunal. And I think you could easily have a much simpler online system where you could extend your lease online simply without all the torture and agonising over 12 pages of mathematical figures.
Absolutely.